Defending Israel with David Harris on JBS is made possible in part by a generous gift in memory of Eric and Mira J. Spector, the Paul and Lynn Late Family Foundation, To Life, to Love, Barbara and Bob Goodkind, the Patricia Worthen Ullman Foundation,
Hello JBS viewers, I'm David Harris and this is Defending Israel. This is the season of Passover and families gather to read the Haggadah and to tell the story, again, that ageless, timeless, inspiring, remarkable story of the Jewish exodus from Egypt and all that ensued both before, leading up to it, and of course after. Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments, and eventually, with Joshua, the entry back into the Promised Land. But at this time of year, I'd like to share two other Exodus stories, modern-day Exodus stories, that I think should also be part of our consciousness, both at this time of year, Pesach, but frankly, around the calendar. The first begins in the Soviet Union. After the Tsars fell and the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, for a brief moment, some Jews had hope that the Bolshevik language, the communist vision of equality and brotherhood would somehow translate into a better life for the millions of Jews in what became the USSR. It wasn't long, however, before those hopes and visions were destroyed. And once again, anti-Semitism, both in old forms, well known to Russian soil, and in new forms, specific to the communist regime, took hold. And we feared, those on the outside, those at the time watching this, that we were witness to a cultural genocide of the Jewish people, a deliberate attempt by Moscow to extinguish the last vestiges and flames of Jewish life, all to be replaced by the communist vision, which of course centrally included atheism and had no room for any competing ideologies. Now, we go through several decades and we fast forward to the late 1960s. Israel has just won an extraordinary, miraculous, redemptive victory in what became known as the Six-Day War, in which it not only defeated its Arab foes, but it also defeated the Soviet weaponry that armed its Arab foes. And a number of Soviet Jews began to wake up to a new consciousness about Israel, about Zionism, about their Jewish identity. And by the late 1960s, a group of 15 or 20 families in Soviet Georgia wrote a letter to the United Nations, essentially asking the United Nations to help free them, allow them to leave the Soviet Union, allow them to resettle to Israel, where they had family, to repatriate to the Jewish homeland. Now, you might say, okay, a few people wrote a letter, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is the fact that the Soviet Union was hermetically sealed shut. The word emigration, emigratia in Russian, did not exist in the Soviet vocabulary. This was an act of sheer chutzpah, of sheer audacity. And this could easily have landed the signatories in the Gulag system, never to be heard from again. And yet, with extraordinary bravery, they asserted this right. And others in the Soviet Union, one by one, here, there, whether in Tbilisi, Georgia, or in Baku, Azerbaijan, or in Moscow, or Leningrad, or Kharkov, or Kiev, or Tallinn, or Riga, Chernovtsi, Kishinev, wherever, began as well to assert this right. Atpusti narod moy was their message. In Hebrew, Shelach et Ami, the central message of the Passover Seder, let my people go, they said to the Kremlin. And the voices were heard around the world. They were heard by Jews. They were heard by Israel. They were heard from Washington. They were heard elsewhere. And slowly what became known as the Soviet Jewry movement emerged from the 60s and gained form and depth and breadth and substance in the 70s and 80s. It wasn't a simple process. The Soviet Union understood that if they let these people go, then the chances were that lots of other people in the Soviet Union, non-Jews, but people who simply wanted to breathe freedom, would apply to leave. And the workers' paradise, as the Soviet Union called itself, the home of the Brotherhood of Nationalities, as it referred to itself, would crumble. So Jews knew that in asking for this right to leave, they were playing with fire, and yet it did not deter them. And many paid a very high price. We know about people like Natan Sharansky, who ended up spending 9 years in the Soviet Gulag system, much of it in solitary confinement, much of it on extended hunger strikes as his act of resistance. And there were others in the Gulag that were sent by kangaroo courts and in show trials. There were others who became what was known as refuseniks, people who had applied to leave and been refused, and refused again and a third time and a fourth time, some for 10 years or longer, living inside the Soviet Union, but having lost their jobs, suffering social isolation, suffering harassment and persecution, occasional arrests, their families suffering alongside them, and yet unable to leave. People like Ida Nudel, Yosef Begun, Yuli Kosharovsky, the names are many. They go on for pages after pages after pages, but nothing stopped them. This is the point. The point was that their Jewish consciousness had been awoken. The Zionism of Israel appealed to them. They understood they needed to get out of this restrictive, oppressive Soviet Union, which was unhealthy for Jews and all other living human beings, except for the corrupt leadership and bureaucracy, the so-called apparatchiki, the KGB and the Communist Party elites. And I think this is one of the most extraordinary stories in Jewish history, whether ancient or modern. This small group of modern-day Jews taking on the most oppressive, the most powerful, totalitarian, tyrannical system on earth in their day, and not backing down, and insisting on their right to leave, and insisting along the way as well, prior to leaving, prior to finally getting permission, insisting on the right to study Hebrew, on the right to gather together to study Jewish history, to learn something about their identity. Now, it's one of those historical ironies that even at the same time that the Soviet Union was trying to suppress any expression of Jewish identity or consciousness, in a way, Stalin himself had almost assured Jewish continuity. What do I mean? Well, we Jews often debate the question, mi Yehudi, who is a Jew? Well, for Stalin as leader of the Soviet Union in the 1930s, he figured it out for himself. And his answer was very simple. If your mother and father are Jewish, according to the Soviet passport, and in every Soviet internal passport, not for overseas travel, but for domestic purposes, every Soviet passport had what was called Pyatый punkt, the fifth point, nationalnost, nationality. And Stalin determined that if both of your parents were Jewish in their documents, didn't matter whether you felt Jewish, didn't feel Jewish, felt you were Zionist, non-Zionist, anti-Zionist, went to a synagogue, didn't go to a synagogue. For Joseph Stalin, and therefore for the Soviet system, you were a Jew. So while we continue to argue over these issues of who is a Jew and who is a rabbi, etc., for Stalin, it was pretty straightforward. Now, if your mother was, say, Jewish and your father was, say, Ukrainian or Belarusian, then at the age of 16 you had a choice. And many children at the age of 16 opted for the non-Jewish identity because it seemed like an easier life, trying to get into a university, trying to get a job, trying to get permission to live in a particular city. It seemed easier. But irony of ironies, many who married other Jews stayed Jewish, again, whether or not they had any religious or national identity. And then when the 60s and 70s emerged and this movement started, let my people go, for them, they had an advantage. And interestingly as well, and I find this one of the supreme historical turnarounds, Jews who during the Second World War throughout Europe were trying as best they could, if they could, to find a non-Jewish identity so they could hide from the Nazis and their collaborators and pass as Protestants, as Catholics, whatever. Those Jews who had chosen the non-Jewish nationality were suddenly interested in, wow, there's an advantage to being Jewish in the Soviet Union, perhaps. Many disadvantages, but the one advantage is I might be able to get out. So how do I change those papers? How much is it going to cost me? Poblatu, the Russian term for using influence or through corruption. How do I change those papers so 20, 30 years after the Holocaust, Jews who wanted to hide their identity were now trying to find their Jewish identity in order to potentially apply, and if they were lucky, to be able to leave the Soviet Union. And over the years, beginning of the late 60s through the 70s and 80s, the numbers varied. The Soviet Union never wanted to make it easy for the Jews to leave. They used the argument that Jews were being repatriated to the ancient homeland Israel. And this was a way of essentially telling other nationalities, Ukrainians, Armenians, Georgians, don't even think about trying to copy the Jews and leave, because your homeland is right here on Soviet soil. So we saw, in some years a few thousand more, in some years a few thousand less. We saw a peak in 1979, if I recall, of about 50,000 Jews who were able to leave, and then the numbers dropped through the 80s, and then under Gorbachev, the Soviet president who took power in 1985, the numbers began to increase again after 87, 88, with the help of the Reagan administration and the Bush administration that followed. And today, as we gather for Passover Seders, we can say that as many as 2 million Jews have managed to leave the Soviet Union, or what is of course now the ex-Soviet Union. It is a remarkable story of tenacity and courage on the part of so many. And look how the infusion of well over 1 million Jews to Israel has done so much to elevate Israel, revitalize Israel. You'll find Russian-speaking Jews now in every nook and cranny of Israeli society, from the leadership to the military to science to medicine to music to culture to education, keep going in every direction. Here in the United States, it's estimated that there are as many as 750,000 Russian-speaking Jews from this exodus. In New York, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in San Francisco, and other major cities. And they are a remarkable group of people who within one generation have adapted to life in America, integrated, in many cases created their own Jewish organizations where they feel a higher level of comfort. And now when you look after October 7th in particular, Notice how many of that generation and of generation 1.5 are now on the front lines of Jewish advocacy and pro-Israel advocacy. These are people who understand anti-Semitism, who smell it. These are people who know from their Soviet experience that anti-Zionism, which was to such a large degree a Soviet invention, was simply a way of masking raw, unadulterated anti-Semitism. So others may have those Talmudic debates at university or elsewhere about whether anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism or not. But for Soviet Jews who experienced the USSR, they know. They smell it, they see it, they see Soviet methodology and tactics even today in the anti-Israel movement. And they are among the loudest voices, the strongest, most courageous voices in the United States, as in Canada and Australia and Germany, wherever else they settled outside Israel. And Jewish organizations need to understand and reach out to this large community and build stronger bridges, because they are not only an essential part of American Jewry. In so many ways, they encapsulate much of the leadership and backbone and spine and vision and clarity that we especially need now, when unfortunately some Jews in America are a bit cloudy and confused about where they stand or what's going on. So we have this extraordinary story, and yet for some reason, we don't tell it. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about it at Passover, at the Seder, something that many of us witnessed in our own lifetimes. We don't talk about it in Jewish day schools. We don't talk about it in synagogue after-school programs. We rarely hear about it from the Bima when rabbis speak to us. We need to know this story. We need to know that the courage of Moses and Aaron and Nachshon, and we're told the 600,000 who left Egypt, was an extraordinary story, but it's a story that has continued, not just by our retelling, but by the replaying of modern Jewish communities, the millions in the Soviet Union being a very good example. And there's a second story that I believe we need to tell, a second story that I was privileged to witness as I witnessed the Soviet story, to play a small part in as well. It was on a different continent, the African continent, and it involved tens of thousands of Jews who were derisively called Falasha Jews by others in Ethiopia, but who were proud Jews who lived largely in an isolated province called Gondar, in a series of villages, a number of which I had the chance to visit, but who for many years, if not centuries, actually believed that they were perhaps the only Jews on earth. But it didn't stop them. They traced their history back to the time of Solomon and Sheba, and they stood tall and erect, and they continued their traditions with their own religious leaders and their own special holidays, including one Sigid, in which I had the opportunity to participate on a hilltop in Gondar province in Ethiopia in the 1980s. And I saw not only this sense of cohesion and pride and determination to continue to live as Jews in what was hostile territory. The regime in Addis Ababa, the capital, was communist, led by Colonel Mengistu. The majority population of Ethiopia was both Muslim and Christian, and many did not treat the Jews well. They looked down on the Jews. Again, that derogatory term they used for them. And yet, when the opportunity came, because the dream had never vanished, the opportunity that was central to their prayers and their faith and their belief, Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, when they realized that this was not just a vision, this was a reality, a pulsating reality, now known as the sovereign state of Israel, reborn in 1948. And as Israel became aware of the communities in Ethiopia and began to send shlichim, emissaries, to make contact. And some from Ethiopia managed to make the trek somehow to Israel. And they exchanged information and exchanged ideas about what to do next. But fast forward, and by the 1980s, you had these extraordinary operations of rescue that were being organized principally by Israel, with the help of organizations elsewhere in the world, including here in the United States, with the single goal of saving Jews from Ethiopia and helping those who wished to leave, which was the vast, vast majority, in order to help them to leave. But it wasn't simple. Again, for very familiar reasons. A communist government, a desire not just to simply open the exit door and let Jews walk out. The government figured, well, if the Jews want to leave, we're going to get something big for this. Otherwise, we're certainly not going to let them go. So, as an eyewitness to those villages, to the conditions in which they lived, the villages I saw, for example, and I probably visited 5 or 6, did not have a single motor vehicle. They did not have a single road connecting them to any other place of habitation, much less any retail place. Most of the houses were made of dung and twigs and mud, very little brick or concrete. I saw no glass in the windows. So this was a very rudimentary lifestyle, but in every village, central to the organization of life for that Jewish community was the synagogue. Or in one case, I remember the 2 synagogues, which brought a chuckle because, of course, it meant Jews could assert the synagogue they didn't go to rather than the one they did go to if they wished. But I saw how Israel went to such lengths in order to help rescue these Jews. And I saw the lengths to which the Jews themselves were prepared to take risks, life-saving risks. And how many of us realize that in that period, the lifetimes of many of us, literally thousands of Jews from Ethiopia trying to escape Ethiopia on foot to neighboring countries which in some cases were hostile and which required those Jews to try to hide their identity. How many thousands of Jews died en route, died from hunger, died from heat, died from the challenge of walking hundreds of miles, sometimes with the elderly or the children on their backs, literally, as they tried to make it across hostile terrain in order to eventually go up to Yerushalayim, the center of their millennia-long prayers. And you know, with the passage of years, those who visited Israel couldn't help but notice more and more Ethiopian Jews living in Israel, beginning to participate in life in Israel, obviously having to make this massive leap from the villages they had come from, where, as I said, often without motor vehicles, often without brick or concrete structures, often without glass for windows. They were going to a technologically advanced society that was a massive, massive social and cultural leap for many. Obviously easier for the young Ethiopians than for their parents and grandparents. But they brought with them their religious leaders and they brought with them their customs. And over time, tens of thousands of Jews were rescued from Ethiopia, notwithstanding those who perished along the way. And yes, it's taken time. It may take a generation or two, but one already sees on every visit to Israel more and more students at the best Israeli universities from Ethiopia, more and more officers in the elite units of the IDF, more and more Israelis in public life from Ethiopia, in the Knesset, in the diplomatic corps, and elsewhere. It's another remarkable story. And it's a story that also puts the lie, once again, to this absurd notion of Israel as some kind of, quote, apartheid society. I ask not just you, JBS viewers, I ask the world. Until the 1980s, how many Western nations had gone to such lengths to rescue tens of thousands of African, dark-skinned people, not to bring them out, as someone once said, in chains for slavery, but eventually on planes to freedom? It's one heck of a story. And why it's not being taught in our Jewish day schools and in our after-school programs, and why the story is not being told from the bima in our synagogues, and why it's not become a regular part of our Passover storytelling alongside with the Exodus from Egypt is still beyond me. We need these stories. We need to remind ourselves of the tenacity and the resilience of the Jewish people, of Jewish belief, and of Jewish faith. Natan Sharansky, whom I've gotten to know very well over the years, held on to a book of Psalms. The only thing that he was apparently allowed to keep from prison to prison during those 9 years. And he will explain how it was those Psalms, the vision of Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. All of those Psalms that speak about Israel, Zion, our future, Jerusalem. We need to tell these stories. And at a time when many Jews, you and I both know, are succumbing to a certain despair. The world is somehow against us. Israel is isolated. American Jews have a bleak future because of what's going on some campuses and all. I think these stories, not just the stories of the Jews who defied the Pharaoh and left Egypt and went through 40 years of struggle until they reached the Promised Land, but the modern day stories with modern day eyewitnesses, myself included, able to tell about millions of people in the Soviet Union who took on a new Pharaoh and didn't necessarily have the 10 plagues to administer, but were successful in making it clear to the Soviet Pharaoh that if they didn't let the Jews go, the United States would lead the punishment of the Soviet Union, and it did, thanks to legislators like Charles Vanek and Henry Scoop Jackson, both non-Jews, who stood with Soviet Jews and with us during that struggle. And tens of thousands of Jews from Ethiopia who were threatened by a communist regime, who were often intimidated by their Muslim and Christian neighbors, nonetheless stood up out of a core belief that there was a Zion, there was a Jerusalem. It was not just in their prayers, it was not just in their dreams, it was now a living, breathing, pulsating reality, and they wanted to be a part of it. These are the stories we need to tell. These are the stories our children need to hear. These are the stories we need to be reminded of when we have those moments of despair, that this is a long, remarkable, unparalleled journey through human history, through thousands of years, and here we are, still able to tell the story. Hag Pesach Sameach, a very good, sweet, and meaningful Pesach to all the JBS viewers. This is David Harris, defending Israel, and looking forward to seeing you again next week.